This series is all about universes, multiverses, planets, worlds, continents and cities. We're delving not into specific games, but into the milieus created for them. We'll be looking at where these settings came from, their major features, and why you should consider them for your own gaming experiences. We're on episode 6, and with it we enter one of the first worlds to be formed around the Dungeons & Dragons game. The world of its most famous of the game's originators, Gary Gygax. Today we look at the Flanaess, on the continent of Uruk, on the planet Oerth, the world of Greyhawk. Greyhawk's origins can be found in the early days of role-playing. In fact, before role-playing was really a thing, at least as we understand it today. There wasn't so much in the way of building stories while traipsing down dungeons slaying monsters, for example. Needless to say, exploring the very earliest origins of Greyhawk as an entity is somewhat murky, to say the least, as there are wrapped up in contradictory reminiscences from those who originally played there, and the whole somewhat partisan view of the origins of Dungeons & Dragons, and role-playing itself. But we will try. One of the things that did happen was various imaginative individuals would take a set of rules, diplomacy, risk, or some form of miniatures wargaming, for example, and create a new playing field to play variants of those games with. A good example of a long-running wargame campaign doing just that can be found in Tony Bath's Hyboria campaign, where players took control of a realm, weathered events in a play-by-mail-esque format, and fought out occurring battles on the tabletop. I'll delve into this more sometime on the channel. Similarly, via the Castles and Crusade Society Wargaming Club and the club's magazine Domesday Book, Gary Gygax created something similar with his Great Kingdom campaign map. Here, participating players got involved in a land grab to stake their claim on their very own corner of the map, and so the grand campaign of it began. One, Dave Arneson, the other author of the original Dungeons & Dragons game, got in on this act, grabbing a chunk of land in the northern portion of the map for Blackmoor, the basis of a Braunstein-type participatory game that he had been running since 1971 in the Great Lakes area of the US. Although the Great Kingdom was not the world of Greyhawk yet, it had a number of notable features already that would eventually be incorporated into the role-playing setting, showing clear lineage between the wargame campaign Great Kingdom and the role-playing world of Greyhawk. The Dry Steppes, the Nyr Dyv, and the Sea of Dust, to name but 3. It was perhaps natural for Gygax to adapt this into a setting for role-playing, as the game of Dungeons & Dragons evolved through Arneson's broad form and Gygax's forge, especially when play of this new game began in the Gygax household. With sparse documentation of those early days, it is difficult to tell exactly, but when you look at the earliest maps of Proto-Greyhawk and Greyhawk, and think of them in terms of game board rather than world building, there are some obvious markers. Greyhawk City, for example, home base for characters braving the depths of the nearby Greyhawk Castle's dungeons, sits almost bang in the middle of the map. This gives radii of development to work with. Close stuff first, near stuff remaining mysterious until needed or explored. Not only that, but the positioning of alignments across the board, map, is also reminiscent. Evil and good realms alternate around the centre, while the proponent of neutrality, again, Greyhawk City, sits slap bang in the middle. It's almost, not quite, but almost, looks as if an alignment chart was dropped onto the map in order to determine which realms were what. Of course, that's not necessarily a true depiction of what happened. For a start, early D&D had only 3 alignments rather than 9, but still. The first hints of the world in a public sense came with the publication of Dungeons & Dragons itself from 1974, and in particular the Greyhawk supplement in 1975. No actual details of the world were in these game volumes, just simple hints and examples that Gygax used to illustrate points of the game. In the background, Gygax was using a map of North America as a basis to detail his own D&D campaign, with Chicago as Greyhawk, Milwaukee as Divers, and Lake Michigan as the Nyr Dyv. As things progressed, And through articles in Dragon magazine and elsewhere, sketchy details about Gygax's emerging world crept out. And note, he was very likely making things up as he went, as necessity of play or article required, as is often the case in such homogeneous world building. People began to get more and more curious about it. The Gnome Cache, a story Gygax wrote for the Dragon, referenced Oerth, and Andre Norton, on Gygax's invitation, wrote Quag Keep in 1978, set in Greyhawk, although still not the Greyhawk players of the D&D game at large were eventually to come to know. Introducing the published version of the setting in Dragon issue 37, Gygax enthused about a line of miniatures, a set of wargaming rules, a set covering the city of Greyhawk, a series of adventure modules covering the dungeons of Castle Greyhawk, and numerous other Greyhawk-centric releases through to 1982. That issue of Dragon arrived in May 1980. In August of that year, the World of Greyhawk Folio arrived on shelves. Let's pause to bear in mind a few things at this point. By 1980, we already had, in the way of published role-playing settings, the city-state of the Invincible Overlord, and several Wilderlands maps and supplements, the first fantasy campaign, essentially Arneson's Blackmoor, Tecumseh in the form of Empire of the Petal Throne, the nascent Glorantha of RuneQuest fame, and Arduin. Expectation of the long-hinted Greyhawk, home to many of the wizards whose spells adorned the pages of Dungeons & Dragons, from the then premier publisher of role-playing games, TSR, was high. What we got was a 32-page booklet, 4 pages of which were dedicated to runes and portentous glyphs. While admittedly the information in the book is fairly dense, but very high level in scope, no Judges Guild-esque hex-by-hex features, but plenty of major geographic feature and nation descriptions. And the colour 30 miles per hex map was glorious, spanning 2 poster-sized, fantastically coloured sheets. The set itself, though, was disappointing. Other than the map. The map was utterly fantastic, and the tale of its creation by artist Eileen is fascinating in itself. The story begins with Gygax inquiring about the larger sheets that could be managed by the printing house TSR was using. From there, he determined the size of landmass of the world that he envisaged could be depicted, using the scale that he had in mind. Giving a draft sketch to work from, Darlene then set about pretty much being the architect of most of the cartographical detail that we know today, across multiple iterations of the Flanaess settings map. In fact, while Gygax had conceived of expanding the world beyond the Flanaess, such was the glory of Darlene's map. Despite a handful of efforts here and there, it has never needed to tread beyond that initial area. As a kid, I played with Letraset, titling my own self-made books and maps with the stuff. It was fun and gave my efforts some artistic feel. But remember, this was in the days before desktop publishing and digital font files. Darlene took this whole transfer thing to a stratospheric level within her Greyhawk map, using carefully cut sheets of colour to depict even the contours of the oceans. Her lettering was by hand, planned out so that she could leave the necessary gaps within geographic features to fit it in. And once done, the whole thing was photographed and sent to the printers for reproduction. These days, someone would slap together in Photoshop or similar, bung text in using a pretty font and add a glow or other outline effect to make the text pop against the map's art. Pretty as some of the maps available are today, from a sheer scale of effort, they pale in comparison to Darlene's work. The map was to stay with the World of Greyhawk through to 1992 and beyond, with adjustments for the progressing history of the Flanaess, and it served to influence what role-playing game campaign maps should aspire to for decades. It might look a little dated today, but nothing should be taken away from the incredible work of art that it was. So we got a fantastic map and a pitiful list of nations and areas. Okay, pitiful is a little strong, but the folio fell short of expectations. That's the point. Far better was to arrive in 1983 with the World of Greyhawk campaign setting box set. Here, the material of the folio was expanded up to an 80-page guide, Volume 3, so we are informed. I'm guessing in the same way that the original Star Wars movie was eventually labelled Episode 4, even though fandom had yet to create a prequel volumes 1 and 2 to my knowledge. A 48-page glossography of gaming stuff, stats and counter tables and the like, and another copy of the Darlene map. You could never have too many copies of that map. Anyway, this was much better and far more usable, and only one page of bloody runes. It also helped that in the interim more articles by Gygax and others appeared in Dragon to give more details to the setting. Anyway, I picked up my copy of this wonderful gem from a wargaming shop in York one school holiday and devoured its pages avidly. The Wilderness material had already provided me with the bug of world building, but this World of Greyhawk set cemented it absolutely and forever. Most of my role-playing has been done within worlds of my own creation, but the spark, the foundation of my scribblings and delvings, really took off with this set. Weaving in and out of the campaign setting releases themselves, TSR had released a number of modules from 1978 to 1983 that were set within the Flaness. Most by Gygax, many based on his own campaign to one extent or another, some not by Gygax but slotting nicely into the lore of the world, and some name-dropping Greyhawk locales as a default, whether they felt like they naturally fit or not. Standouts here are obviously the Village of Homlet, the Slaver series, and the Giants and Drow Connected series, and the Special series, the S modules. More was to come, particularly in the form of the Temple of Elemental Evil, which had been hinted at and promised way back in 1979 with the publication of the Village of Homlet, 2 World of Greyhawk adventure modules styled after the World of Greyhawk box set, Morden Canaan's Fantastic Adventure and Isle of the Ape, and 2 Gygax-penned novels, Saga of Old City and Artifact of Evil. These last 2 were important developments, as TSR had proven that there was a market for fiction tied to gaming in 1984 with the release of Dragonlance. It could have been a boost to the popularity of Greyhawk, but unfortunately, such was the juggernaut of Dragonlance and the declining relationship between Gygax and the company that he had founded, that Greyhawk never rose to that potential. Following Gygax's departure, 4 more Greyhawk novels were released: Master Wolf, The Price of Power in 1987, The Demon Hand and the Name of the Game in 1988 by Rose Estes, none of which proved as popular as the Dragonlance novels and the emerging Forgotten Realms setting. Gygax soldiered on with his series in his post-TSR days, working within a framework that allowed him to use certain names from his creation and not others. These volumes he released through New Infinities and continued on from Artifact of Power. City of Hawks, Knight Errant, Sea of Death, Come Endless Darkness, a series that is highly enjoyable, if somewhat prone to Gygax's unique take on prose. Estes delivered The Eyes Have It in 1989 for TSR, and Nightwatch finished TSR's involvement with Greyhawk as a setting for novels in 1990 by Robin Wayne Bailey. Other than the novels, 1985's Isle of the Ape pretty much capped off things for Greyhawk as a setting, for the time being anyway. There were some gems in the post-Gygax closing years of first edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, notably the Greyhawk Adventures hardcover, which was both the last first edition hardback and arguably the first second edition one, as it was written to be compatible with both. The final first edition Greyhawk product was the awful parody module, Castle Greyhawk, which many believe insulting to Gygax's tenure on the Dungeons & Dragons game and his own World of Greyhawk, effectively now lost to him, wrapped up in TSR's intellectual property. That particular tale has coloured my own attitude towards publishing my own world, but more on that sort of thing in a future video. Second edition AD&D arrived in 1989, and with it a handful of Greyhawk products. A City of Greyhawk box set. Remember that it was meant to be a 1981 or 1982 product, as originally promised. The Awful Adventures, Child's Play, Puppets and Gargoyle, and the not-so-bad Fate of Istus and Veil of the Mage. In 1990, a trilogy of adventures built on the City of Greyhawk set, Falcon's Revenge, Falcon Master and Flames of the Falcon, which came with 3D models, and were not actually that bad, and quite fun to play. Two monsters also turn up. Monster adventures, that is. Vecna Lives, which is a high-level romp across the Flanaess, and can, if played right, scare the bejesus out of a group of, especially if they're playing their own long-standing characters. And Greyhawk Ruins, a much better incarnation of Castle Greyhawk's dungeons, with, unfortunately, damn awful maps. This latter work is difficult to get into, but having redrawn the maps and reworked many of the encounters and themes, as well as more closely linking in those modules that were originally conceived as extensions to the unpublished Greyhawk dungeons, Dungeon Land and Land Beyond the Magic Mirror, and the aforementioned Isle of the Ape, it's a heck of a lot of fun. I can't say the original is good because of the additional work that I believe necessary to make it good, but it's a start. And then the Flanaess erupted into war. Remember, back with the Folio release, when we were promised miniatures and war games, well, some of the miniatures turned up, but no war game, until 1991. Leading up to this game, the duology Five Shall Be One and Howl from the North set the stage for the counter-war game Greyhawk Wars. See my video on that gem. It's not quite the promised war game with hundreds of miniatures tramping across Greyhawk in a mighty campaign, but it was a lot of fun to play nonetheless. The war it depicted led into 1992's revitalisation of the campaign setting with the From the Ashes campaign set, essentially a rework of the 1983 set with volumes corresponding roughly to the books in that old box. The Darnine map was here, with new text and national borders in place to represent the post-war Flanaess, and other goodies were included alongside the books, reference cards and monster sheets. Ignoring Border Watch and Patriots of Ulek for the flimsy, weak things that they were, the From the Ashes set was central to a number of releases of the Greyhawk Renaissance, a short adventure compilation, Treasures of Greyhawk, a What Rary Did Next adventure and sourcebook in Rary the Traitor, and a look into the Good Kingdoms with the Marklands, and a delve into Ayuz's realm, with Ayuz the Evil and the Adventure City of Skulls. And then, well, nothing. A planned supplement on the Great Kingdom, Ivid the Undying, was released as a free download in 1995 in draft form, probably one of the earliest free downloads for an RPG company that I can remember. But largely, Greyhawk was a void filled only by its fandom, for TSR had effectively abandoned it. The most prominent source for Greyhawk during this period, facilitated by the new digital revolution, came in the form of the Oearth Journal, the periodical that started in 1995 and is still going today. Link in the description. The journal is an absolute must for Greyhawk players. TSR eventually picked up Greyhawk again for another stab in 1998, with The Adventure Begins, a sort of an update to From the Ashes. A player's guide to Greyhawk, a series of moderately enjoyable adventures, the Crypt of Lysandra the Mad, the Doomgrinder, the Return of the Eight and the Starkends, and the monstrous campaign adventure Return to the Tomb of Horrors. This latter puts some nasty twists to the original tomb and is well worth checking out. 1999 gave us some silver anniversary TSR releases that were defaulted to Greyhawk, whether the originals had been or not. Against the Giants, The Liberation of Jeff, which was obviously a Greyhawk thing, a Return to the Keep on the Borderlands, which wasn't originally, a Return to the White Plume Mountain, and Deep Dwarven Delve. This was a first edition adventure packaged up with TSR's silver anniversary set. The Scarlet Brotherhood received its own sourcebook, at last, this year too, and Greyhawk became once more a place for novels. But don't get too excited though. The Greyhawk Classics novels are universally bad. However, they are a fun read if you don't approach them intellectually, in the same way that cheesy 1980s fantasy movies are a fantastic watch if you don't engage your brain too much. Two turned up in 99, Against the Giants and White Plume Mountain. The year 2000 showed up, the millennium, the year Wizards of the Coast put their third edition of Dungeons & Dragons out and dropped the advanced tag forever. Greyhawk's second edition product line was rounded off with a sequel to the Slave Lords series Enslavers and Die, Vecna, Die, one of two products, the other being the Apocalypse Stone, intended to be campaign enders, ostensibly Wizards saying, End your second edition campaigns now, so that you can come over to our shiny new third edition. Greyhawk, under third edition, was fixed as the default setting for the game. The example gods in the player's handbook were Greyhawk gods, and all of the core Dungeons & Dragons adventures were set in the Flanaess, the Forge of Fury and the Fright at Tristor. A gazetteer was released to the RPGA, which was then publicly released as the Living Greyhawk Gazetteer, in preparation for Greyhawk to be used as the official Living tournament setting, a concept that had been introduced for areas of the Forgotten Realms in the 1990s, the Living City and the Living Jungle. Oh, and another of those novels, Descent into the Depths of the Earth. Honestly, they're bad, but still worth a read. Or listen. I have them on Audible, and they're great for driving to. 2001 was mostly about novels, with Greyhawk classics coming out for Keep on the Borderlands, Queen of the Demon-Wed Pits, and The Temple of Elemental Evil. Speaking of which, The Return to the Temple of Elemental Evil was also released this year, which, well, see my worst Dungeons & Dragons adventures for my thoughts on it. The Tomb of Horrors got the novel treatment in 2002, and that was a thankful end to that particular line. 2003 saw the Temple of Elemental Evil getting a very buggy computer game release, which I cover more in my video on the Temple as a whole, from its first edition release through to its Original Adventures Reincarnated edition by Goodman Games. Again, link in the description somewhere. Then things slowed down. Well, they really slowed down from the start of third edition. You see, one thing that Wizards of the Coast had spotted in their takeover of TSR in 1997 was that adventure modules and campaign settings didn't really sell very well, and they'd put together the D20 license and OGL to sort of pass that torch for that kind of thing to third-party publishers. So while Wizards did trickle out the odd adventure, they were more really in the market of rulebooks and expansions to the D&D game rather than support for Greyhawk as a setting. As the default world, it did receive some support, mainly via the Living Greyhawk efforts and indicators in rulebooks, but rarely in direct sense. Effectively, the Oearth Journal was still the flamekeeper for Greyhawk as an ongoing concern. The final Greyhawk book under 3rd edition was Expedition to the Ruins of Greyhawk, which revisited the Castle Greyhawk of the Greyhawk Ruins fame. Sort of. It's a bit of a pain to marry those two products together, but it can be done. Under 4th edition, some of the DM reward programs released updated old classic Greyhawk adventures, and the Tomb of Horrors got an official 4th edition release, but Greyhawk was no longer the default setting and was largely forgotten. The Slavers and Special series of modules got hardback collected reprints in 2013 as part of a lead-up to Dungeons & Dragons' 40th anniversary. The U series of modules set within Greyhawk got a 5th edition update in 2019 with Ghosts of Saltmarsh, and two of Goodman's Original Adventures Reincarnated celebration of and 5th edition conversions are old Greyhawk-centric adventures, 2019's Expedition to the Barrier Peaks and 2021's Temple of Elemental Evil, but pretty much they are just redos and compilations, and that's all there was to be had from a Greyhawk perspective. Unless you step a little beyond official Greyhawk and into the realms of, it's Greyhawk, but we can't say that because it's not us that owns the IP. Before his death in 2008, Gary Gygax was revisiting his old city and dungeon with Troll Lord Games via their Castles and Crusades game, one of the glossier games of the OSR movement. This revisiting led to a series of adventures and sourcebooks. Ugsburg, that proxy for Greyhawk City, Dark Chateau, Ugsburg class options, the Outs Inn, Ugsburg Town Halls and Moatgate, the Eastmark Gazetteer, Ugsburg Storehouse District and East Corner, and Castle Zagig, the Upper Works. This last was fairly impressive, a box set of 5 books and an illustration booklet to deal with the upper levels of Castle Zagig. All of these volumes have their merits, but the fact that Gygax's passing in 2008, it took the wind out of the whole project's sails, and it detracts from it. Castle Greyhawk, Castle Zagig, will never be completed, and we will never get a, putting tongue in cheek now, true version of Gygax's dungeon. To be honest, I don't think we were ever going to, as Gygax himself has admitted to changing things regularly, forgetting wadges of it, rearranging things, and purposely adding misinformation into what little has been published in order to put players who are still in his home campaign off the scent. Given that the 1981 to 1982 glorious schedule that we were given back in the Folio release days that never happened, I think chasing after a one true Gygaxian Castle Greyhawk is one of hobby's great white whales. One more attempt at depicting Castle Greyhawk in all but name is 2014's Castle of the Mad Archmage by Joseph Bloch. Obviously a labour of love, this iteration tries its best to draw upon what little we do know about Gygax's original dungeon. In my opinion, it falls short of being good, but doesn't really enter the realms of being bad. A sort of indifferent take on the castle and its dungeons that tries hard, but ends up being little more than a tribute act. Nice try, though. As I write this in 2023, Greyhawk is still alive, within that worthy periodical, The Earth Journal, and countless gaming tables around the world. Will Wizards of the Coast ever release support for it? Doubtful, especially since Greyhawk is perhaps more grounded in pseudo-medievalism than the direction the core Dungeons & Dragons game has progressed down. Who knows? I think at this point in the setting's history, it doesn't really matter. I don't think it would benefit from a 5e or a 1D&D iteration, and I do believe it serves a purpose better as an occasionally visited revered monument on how things were. Greyhawk is not gone, nor is it forgotten, but it is of its age. Greyhawk's wargaming roots are obvious in its composition, and it is a great example of a world created as a gaming aid. The setting is very medieval and reminiscent of much of the swords and sorcery fantasy fiction that influenced the design of Dungeons & Dragons at the outset. Dungeons & Dragons has many worlds, but it is really only Greyhawk that screams D&D game world from the rooftops. You can see this in that it is perhaps the only setting, regardless of edition used, where the D&D rules don't have to be altered in any way to depict its inhabitants. Despite its obvious game orientation, Greyhawk is also a living world. Each of its nations has a fairly well-defined identity, and this can be used by a Dungeon Master to great effect when playing the setting at a meta level, around the more personal level actions of the player's characters. Comparing it to, say, the Forgotten Realms, what Greyhawk lacks in fine detail, it more than makes up for in definition. We may have pages of sourcebooks and maps for, say, Cormyr from the Realms, but this serves more to make the place seem an academic study. For Friondi of the Flaneas, we don't have as much detail, even with the wonderful Markland sourcebook, but we can certainly personify it as an embattled kingdom of lawful goodness and chivalry. With Greyhawk as a city, for me at least, you can clearly feel the roots of Lankmar calling, and prior to the release of the City of Greyhawk material itself, I was known for substituting in Fritz Lieber's City of 1,000 Smokes for detail. And that brings me to another one of Greyhawk's features: detail. Greyhawk, in its officially published materials, contains just enough material to make the setting usable for the enterprising Dungeon Master that enjoys putting meat onto scaffolding. By accident or design, it does not swamp the gamer with tome upon tome of minutiae, but instead spells things out, like the nature of a nation, as I mentioned, in broadband terms. Sure, materials such as the Earth Journal have given avenues for people to fill in details, but I don't believe such a thing as the journal could exist for many more detailed settings. Thanks to Volo, for example, we know almost every type of wine served in every village in between Baldur's Gate and Waterdeep. Thanks to Pluffett Smedger, we only know that there is a broad canvas between Greyhawk City and Valuna City, in which we can get our creative juices to work in. Greyhawk is also more black and white when it comes to good, evil, law and chaos. This is obviously a reflection of the Dungeons & Dragons alignment system. But here it is writ large, as it was in its origin in faction form, which has been diluted over time and additions as they've marched on. Demons are at play within the hierarchy of the chaotic evil lands, devils amongst those of the lawful evil nature. Neutrality is a faction embodied by modern Canaan in his circle or citadel, aimed at retaining balance between capitalized law, chaos, good and evil. Alignment isn't just something that determines a character's basic outlook to certain aspects of sociology. It's a tangible dedication to an existing and overarching cosmic force. Greyhawk is a solid, easy to understand, partially completed canvas for gaming, capturing the core essence of Dungeons & Dragons, with more than enough room left for dungeon masters to set their own imaginations free to colour in whichever parts of it they so choose, using the palette of their choice. I think role-playing gamers fall into three broad camps: the total homebrewers, the modders, and the ones that just want details to weave their adventures through. Greyhawk is a setting for the modder camp. If you want the details, there are some out there, but you will only get so far before you're going to have to roll up your sleeves and fill in the blanks that you need for yourself. It's also a world, now here's a term to coin, for gamer archaeologists. Now I've coined it, let me explain it. The Greyhawk material is full of throwaway snippets and references to people, places and historical events that have never been detailed, or have only been detailed in a cursory manner, or in the pages of fan sources, such as the Earth Journal. Take Vecna and Kaz, for example. In Eldritch Wizardry, we were introduced to the Sword of Kaz and the Hand and Eye of Vecna, with some basic details that Vecna was a powerful lich and Kaz was his bodyguard. When we get to the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide, we find that Kaz used his famous magical sword to rise against Vecna, and that he defeated his master at the cost of his own destruction. In second edition's Book of Artifacts, this is further expanded, and we discover hints of the exploits of individuals that have used the fell artifacts remaining from these evil individuals. Even further details were brought to the surface during the Vecna trilogy: Vecna Lives, the Ravenloft adventure Vecna Reborn, and the epic adventure Die Vecna Die, whereupon Vecna became the god the Dungeons & Dragons 3rd edition game had treated him, and has done ever since. All of that expanded from a few paragraphs in the original Eldritch Wizardry book, and still the history of Vecna and Kaz has yet to be completely detailed. There are many other such snippets to explore, both within various iterations of the maps of the Flaness and in the sourcebooks and modules, especially adventure introductions, such as that for the original Tomb of Horrors. As an archaeological dungeon master, you can go digging for clues for these references, using them as seeds to wrap your own theories around, or perhaps even connecting 2 or 3 of them together into a single narrative for a multiple point of entry adventure or campaign. This sort of digging of the imagination drives many of the articles contributed to the Earth Journal, and is a most entertaining pastime. So if you want a detail-light but character-rich setting, which doesn't particularly get in the way of your own storytelling, which has numerous dangling loose ends that you can use for inspiration, then Greyhawk certainly is something for you.